Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. Today, we're going to break down an absolutely monumental turning point in human history. We're going to explore how a single, seemingly isolated event, an event that ultimately claimed over 20 million lives and completely shattered ancient empires, actually began. It is a wild story about modern technology violently clashing with ancient grudges.
Now, you might be looking at this question and thinking, can a simple wrong turn in a car really start a global war? I mean, it sounds like a ridiculous premise for a movie, doesn't it? But as our sources reveal, the outbreak of World War I was driven by this truly bizarre mix of sheer coincidence and rigid, unforgiving geopolitics. To really grasp this, we have to look past the memorized dates and names and look at the underlying structures.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the spark and the dynamite.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline because the sheer coincidence here is just staggering. It's June 28, 1914. The Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand is visiting Sarajevo in an open-top car. At 10 a.m., a revolutionary throws a bomb at him, but it literally bounces off the car and injures the officers behind him instead. Ferdinand escapes. You'd think, okay, the crisis is averted, right? No. By midday, Ferdinand decides he wants to visit those injured officers in the hospital. In the afternoon, his driver mistakenly takes a wrong turn, tries to back up, and completely stalls the car a mere 5 feet away from a 19-year-old revolutionary named Gavrilo Princip. Moments later, Princip shoots the Archduke.
But here's the absolutely critical distinction we need to make. Gavrilo Princip, he was just the matchstick. The blast that followed, a catastrophic 4-year global war, it didn't happen just because of that one match. It happened because over several decades, the empires of Europe had quietly built a massive mountain of dynamite right beneath themselves.
Which brings us to Section 2, the 4 pillars of war. Let's look at that mountain of dynamite. Our sources break this macro-level view down into 4 primary pillars. First up is nationalism, and we're talking about an aggressive, race-based nationalism where rulers convince their citizens of their absolute superiority over neighboring countries. Second, imperialism. According to the historical analysis, this was driven heavily by capitalist powers, kind of like the East India Company, looking to expand their borders just to secure cheap labor, raw materials, and outright loot. Third is militarism, which is a massive reliance on brute force. And finally, alliances, these incredibly complex, secret treaties forged out of deep jealousy and paranoia about who is invading whom. And this brilliantly illustrates that third pillar, militarism. Between 1870 and 1914, military spending among the 6 great powers, that's Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, it didn't just creep up, it quadrupled. It shot from roughly 94 million pounds to 4 times that amount. The entire continent was armed to the teeth, basically just waiting for an excuse to use all these new toys. But beneath the massive military budgets and the secret treaties, there was a dark, almost absurd irony to this whole conflict. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, they were all first cousins, literally family. As our sources point out, Queen Victoria had previously tried to keep the peace among them, but after her death, this devastating global war essentially devolved into a royal family feud. It was a literal Game of Thrones, but played with millions of real lives.
Let's move to Section 3, a deadly chain reaction.
So these rigid blocks had formed all across Europe. On one side, you've got the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Now, fun fact, Italy originally had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, they backed out right at the start, basically arguing that their treaty was strictly defensive, and since Austria-Hungary initiated the attacks, Italy was like, yeah, we're not bound to help you with this.
So let's watch the dominoes fall. Step 1. An enraged Austria-Hungary declares war on tiny Serbia. Step 2. Russia, acting as the protector of the Slavic people, moves to defend Serbia. Step 3. Germany steps in to back its old friend Austria. Step 4. France rushes in to support its ally, Russia. And finally, Step 5, Germany tries to bypass French forts by marching 750,000 troops right through neutral Belgium. This severely upsets Britain, dragging them into the war too. And because these were massive global empires, colonized nations like India were immediately dragged in to provide soldiers for the British lines. Almost overnight, the whole world was locked in.
Which brings us to the actual battlefield in Section 4, Old Mines, New Weapons.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the terrifying reality of 1914's military tactics. The generals went into this with a completely old-school mentality. I mean, the French troops literally marched in slow columns through the countryside wearing bright blue uniforms with red trousers. It was essentially a lethal game of spot the French soldier. They were marching directly into the modern reality of giant artillery shells, rapid machine gun fire, and devastating dug-in defensive lines. The result was an absolute slaughter that forced an immediate halt to all those rapid advances.
To avoid being flanked, both sides kept digging trenches further and further north until they literally reached the sea. The result was a brutal deadlock stretching all the way from the coast down to Switzerland. And the reality of this trench warfare was just horrific. Soldiers were living in mud so deep it could swallow a person whole. They endured relentless, days-long artillery bombardments that left thousands shell-shocked, all while living alongside poisonous water, rats, disease, and the corpses of their fallen comrades. Millions of lives were sacrificed just to move the battle lines a few mere meters.
Section 5. The soldier's reality. Let's look at the people actually down in the mud.
You have to ask, why did so many commoners, people who had zero personal stake in these royal feuds, willingly march right into machine gun fire? Well, our sources point heavily to linguistic nationalism and media propaganda. Poems like Alfred Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade were heavily used by governments to paint war as this noble, glorious adventure. The media portrayed soldiers as heroic gentlemen, essentially convincing poor, unemployed citizens that enlisting was the ultimate selfless service to their nation.
So, the crucial point is the stark contrast between that glorious propaganda and the grim reality captured by anti-war intellectuals like Wilfred Owen and Thomas Hardy. Take Hardy's poem, The Man He Killed. It beautifully and tragically highlights that a soldier was often just an unemployed, poor man who enlisted to feed his family, forced to shoot another poor man across the battlefield who did the exact same thing. As the poem suggests, had they met in a pub instead of a muddy trench, they would have happily shared a drink.
And it's really vital to note that not everyone just bought into the propaganda. As the horrors of the trenches became clear, there was massive global pushback. Entire French battalions simply gave up their arms and refused to fight. Russian soldiers eventually turned their weapons against their own rulers. Plus, there was fierce resistance from socialist parties, labor groups, and prominent intellectuals across America, Italy, Britain, and Germany. They argued, quite simply, that the working class had absolutely no business dying for imperial greed.
Which leaves us with this final, powerful question. During the first Christmas of the war in 1914, British and German soldiers famously laid down their weapons. They climbed right out of their trenches, sang together, and shared food in the middle of the battlefield. It was this brief, incredible moment of profound shared humanity, right before their commanders ordered them, under threat of death, to go back to slaughtering each other. If the soldiers in the trenches could find peace and friendship so easily, what does that really tell us about the systems of power that forced them to fight? It's a sobering thought to take away from this explainer on the true costs of World War I. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the world around you.